The presidential election between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris is significant, particularly from the perspective of evangelical ministers in the new Apostolic Reformation networks. Many so-called prophets of the NAR and its apostolic networks have made predictions about certain aspects of both candidates that have led their congregations to believe the election is between the champion of the children of God versus the champion of the forces of Satan. Donald Trump, the former president, has maintained significant support among leaders of the NAR and its networks due to his outspoken defense of religious freedoms, anti-abortion stance, and appointments of conservative judges. His administration's policies and rhetoric have resonated with these groups, who view him as a defender of Christian values against what they perceive as a secular and liberal agenda. However, Trump's criminal prosecution, personal conduct, and past behavior, including allegations of immorality and lack of adherence to Christian virtues, have drawn criticism. Some evangelical leaders struggle to reconcile his actions with their moral and ethical standards, but justify their support by focusing on his policies rather than his personal life. Since many leaders in the evangelical community were forced to admit failed prophecies with Trump's loss in the 2020 presidential election, they see his candidacy as a way to salvage their status as prophets and his victory as a potential for claiming that their predictions never failed. Kamala Harris, on the other hand, faces significant scrutiny from evangelicals due to her progressive stance on social issues, particularly her support for abortion rights, LGBTQ rights, and her perceived alignment with secular liberal values. Harris's advocacy for social justice and equality is viewed by these religious leaders as antithetical to their interpretation of biblical teachings. Her record as a senator and former Attorney General of California is often criticized for policies that undermine religious liberties and promote a secular agenda. Additionally, Harris's position on law enforcement and criminal justice reform is seen as too lenient by some conservative Christians. Regardless of the Republican candidate, her victory would be perceived as an open invitation for Satan to govern the United States from the White House. From the perspective of the NAR, the election is not just a political contest, but a spiritual battle for the soul of the nation. They view Trump as a flawed but necessary champion of their values, while Harris is often portrayed as a harbinger of moral decline and secularism. How did evangelical Christianity become so deeply bound to politics? When did evangelical leaders learn to claim prophecy to ensure that members of their congregations voted for their preferred candidate? To find out, we must examine an unusual prophetic claim that was introduced into the latter rain movement during the 1950s. But first, we must examine a little-known history of two leaders of the fundamentalist movement from which this all began. Though the 1944 election might seem insignificant in the modern age, President Franklin Roosevelt's bid for a fourth presidential term was unprecedented and more controversial than his already unprecedented third term. With the United States and its allies at war and closing in on victory, Roosevelt remained popular among most voters in the nation. Republican candidate Thomas Dewey stood little chance of pushing Roosevelt out of what a small but growing group of religious leaders considered to be a fourth-term dictatorship. As it relates to modern evangelicals in the NAR, two significant religious figures led the charge against Roosevelt. The first was Roy E. Davis, a leader of multiple religious organizations and white supremacy groups. Through his very popular radio broadcasts and Christian music stage act, Jack and Granny, Davis leveraged his influence with Christian fundamentalists, Klan operatives, and politicians to organize a pseudo-religious army of voters against anything not aligned with Christian identity or Christian fundamentalism. Davis worked as a director for the Fundamentalist League alongside fellow director Gerald Burton Winrod. Winrod was one of the most outspoken Christian identity leaders of the era. Through his Defenders of the Christian Faith organization, Winrod connected with significant religious figures, even after being branded as a Nazi for his anti-Roosevelt and socialist rhetoric. As the Christian fundamentalists and Christian identity adherents began to merge, Winrod rose to popularity among several key religious figures who would later write the history of the NAR. Besides Davis, Winrod worked closely with Charles Fuller of the Fuller Theological Seminary, Paul Rader of the Christian and Missionary Alliance, Amy Semple McPherson of the Pentecostal First Square Church, and hundreds more. Winrod was a regular feature in the Exploits of Faith magazine, published by evangelist F.F. Bosworth, who mentored William Branham on doctrine during the post-World War II healing revivals. Winrod was one of the key distributors of the anti-Semitic protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion and played a critical role in uniting evangelicals against Roosevelt by convincing them that Roosevelt was part of a Jewish conspiracy of global domination outlined in the protocols. This led to numerous arrests for sedition, in violation of the Smith Act of 1940, and ultimately to the Great Sedition Trial of 1944. Winrod was named as one of 33 ringleaders in the trial, which lasted over 100 days until the trial judge died of an alleged heart attack and a retrial was dismissed. Among those in violation of the Smith Act was Pentecostal minister and evangelist William Branham, who was ordained into a newly established Pentecostal sect by Roy Davis, leader of the Klan. Branham was nearly arrested but somehow managed to come through the ordeal without serving time. Some evidence suggests that he hid in the revivals under his brother's name, Henry Branham, and used Henry's boxing record to establish his stage persona. Branham toured with Davis and other key figures in the Klan from the late 1920s through the mid to late 1930s, and disappeared from the revival scene until after the 1944 trial had ended. In 1945, Branham launched a new revival campaign, claiming that he had received another so-called gift of healing through a vision from God. After gaining popularity, Branham altered his stage persona to claim that an angelic visitation launched his faith-healing career. In 1955, while working with Jim Jones of People's Temple, Branham began claiming to have received a vision of 7 events that would take place. He claimed that this alleged vision happened in 1933 when his church was being built, though history records a much different timeline. Both Branham and his first wife were preaching in Davis Pentecostal sect at that time, and his first Pentecostal tabernacle would not be purchased until November 1936. In the early version of this tale, Branham claimed to have seen a vision of Roosevelt causing the World War, which would have appealed to his Christian identity, leadership, and following. Among the events seen in the alleged vision was that of a female president. The timing of Branham's alleged prophecy coincided with another key event in the history of women in politics. The year before Branham made the claim, Roosevelt's wife Eleanor Ann Lorena Hickok had published a book entitled Ladies of Courage, which encouraged women to enter politics and offered concrete advice on how to get started. Leaders of the NAR often refer to Branham's alleged vision, unaware that Branham made the claim of prophecy over 20 years after the so-called supernatural experience. Evangelical leader Perry Stone, for example, resurrected Branham's prophetic claim to sway the votes of his congregation towards former President Trump. Charisma magazine has published multiple articles on the subject, never mentioning the question surrounding Branham's 1955 claim. When Branham made the claim in 1955, he boasted that he had written the details of the vision onto a piece of paper in 1933. However, when participants in the revival asked to see the paper, Branham claimed that he was mistaken as to the page's location. Branham claimed that the paper was instead buried in the cornerstone of his church purchased in 1936, putting a stop to all questions. In 1960, when it was feared that female voters would sway the public vote towards John F. Kennedy, Christian identity's primary public enemy, Branham altered his vision to include an addition. Branham claimed that his so-called vision was not necessarily describing a female president, but instead a Catholic one. Until Kennedy's death, Branham claimed that the so-called female, or Catholic, president had been fulfilled along with most of the other events. After William Branham's death, when the cornerstone was exhumed, it was found to be empty. Branham's alleged female president prophecy set the standards for NAR and evangelical prophecy that would be used for years to come. Converts to the latter rain movement and splinter groups in NAR history were not concerned when details of a prophecy were significantly altered or removed, or if new details were added to sound more relevant. It was no problem for a vision of a female president to be changed to a male president, or for it to be changed back to a female president, when it could be weaponized for a political cause. In this new standard, truth does not matter, nor the biblical standard for testing a prophet. The only thing that matters is for their victims to obey, and to send their money in large donations.